Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out to the first in our speaker series for this semester. My name is Eldon Yellowhorn. I am chair of the Department of First Nations Studies and also the director of the Indigenous Research Institute. Just to give you a quick background on the IRI, it was created a couple of years ago in 2012. And oddly enough, or coincidentally, it was National Aboriginal Day when we had our inaugural meeting. And the intent of the Indigenous Research Institute is to be the intersection of research at SFU that our professors and researchers are undertaking, where there is a significant content with First Nations, and either as research subjects or as research partners. And so this is our second annual speaker series, and what we do is invite speakers who can lend us their expertise on a variety of topics. And so with that in mind, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. PhD candidate Elisa Vanderborn. She'll be talking on the problem of the individualistic self in the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in the child protection system in British Columbia. Elisa Vanderborn is a PhD student in the Educational Psychology program at Simon Fraser University. With a BA in psychology and an MA in educational psychology, her research interests connect theoretical psychology and social policy. More specifically, her research is concerned with tracing how psychological concepts are interpreted and implemented into institutional practices concerned with child welfare, for example, educational protection and health. Her master's thesis addressed the social implication of individualistic concepts of selfhood in child protection systems in North America, particularly among socially disadvantaged groups. Her PhD extends on this research, comparing social developmental and psychological outcomes associated with institutional care in different groups, namely adoptees from Romania and foster care alumni in British Columbia and Nordic countries. This comparison hopes to provide child protection stakeholders with a psychological perspective on the outcomes associated with the provision of particular social welfare services and practices. This research is intended to help guide social expenditure and legislation towards optimal outcomes for children. Elisa is currently the research coordinator for MODAL Research Group, where she manages multiple local, pan-university, and international projects in psychology and education. I'm very pleased to welcome her for our lecture tonight.
Thank you so much. I hope you can all see me. I'm almost past the podium, so so thank you very much for this kind introduction, Dr. Yellowhorn. And it is a privilege and a pleasure to be sharing with you what I've been up to for the past 5.5 years. And I figure that the best way to begin this is to share with you a couple of personal notes about this research. And you might be wondering why a Brazilian is talking about the Canadian child protection system. And if anyone had told me about 6 years ago that I would be doing research in child protection, I would have said that they were absolutely out of their minds. First, I purposely have avoided a career in counseling psychology because I was very I think I was very afraid of the emotional toll that being a counselor would be. And here I am talking about child protection. And now I have this very different, and in being Brazilian, I think then some people might wonder how can you talk about a system that is so complex and with so many concepts, ideas that are so foreign to someone who had just recently arrived in Canada? I've been here for 10 years. And I would say that now I have a very, I see those as strengths. I think that it is perhaps my experience as a new Canadian and parenting in Canada that allowed me to put into focus notions of community and of individualism that really attuned me to start looking at this kind of research and see if I could look through this lens to try to understand how the system of education worked, and because that was my starting point. And I now see that all the emotionality that is associated with the child protection system, which I was very afraid of in the beginning, it actually has really morphed into the fuel to really propel this research forward. As you can imagine, it's a very difficult area to do research in. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't either read or hear children, family members, teachers, and social workers talk about stories of unimaginable sorrow and pain. And it is perhaps that really keeps driving me to be talking about this topic. And a third note is that I wasn't really looking at Aboriginal issues when I first started this research. This theoretical work, it was really intended to talk about child welfare, and that applies for non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal children alike. But it became quite clear from the beginning, if we take a quick look at the statistics, that it becomes impossible to talk about child protection in Canada without addressing Aboriginal issues. And finally, and this, I really debated whether I would be sharing this personal insecurity with you tonight, but I think that this is perhaps the reason why I should. It's that as a non-Aboriginal researcher, there is a great deal of apprehension to not be part of the phenomena that Cindy Blackstock, who's a wonderful Indigenous she is a scholar and also a wonderful woman, that she talks about how Aboriginal children have been really overrun by very well-intended people. And I'm very concerned about not being part of that statistic. So I'm really, and that's why I jumped at the opportunity to be here, because I would like to see how people are connecting to the research that I'm doing, and to really learn not only from researchers, but from members of the community of how they can help educate me in Aboriginal issues and how we can move forward together. So starting with the research, so with the objectives of this research, I really wanted to highlight the importance of theoretical issues and institutional practices. And here's the reason. Whenever you have any kind of program, so be them in education or in child protection or in health, there is this notion that once the program is in place, that all the theoretical issues have already been worked out. All the theoretical bugs have been ironed out. Now we have a solid program. So then when something goes wrong with the practice, people keep trying to change the practice and seldom go back to the theory to make sure, are we okay? Are we standing on solid ground here? And what I will argue with my research is that in child protection, this has been the fallacy. We are not asking the right questions, and we keep trying to change the practice with very little results. And the second point is that I wanted to extend on a critical consideration of the concept of self and I will talk a little bit more about exactly what I mean by that. But to talk about the implications of the conception of selfhood that we currently hold in North America today. And really, I wanted to connect these dots and say, by connecting, by really abiding to this theoretical perspective, these are the consequences. Are we happy with this? And this is the guiding question of my work. All right, but this research did not start with theory. This research started with a boy. And this boy that I will call James, it's not his real name. I met when he was just about 6 years old, and I had a very brief contact with him. But I know a lot about James because he attended a daycare that a friend of mine owns. And we often talked about James because by age 5, he had already been diagnosed with FASD, with ODD, with ADHD, and with GAD. And by the time he was 7, he was under a very harsh course of psychotropic medication to make his behavior manageable. And I became very shocked and very curious as to how someone so young could be under such a harsh course of intervention. In my mind, there were so many different things that could have been done prior to this kind of intervention, using drugs that are not even tested on children. So I wanted to learn more about James, and I found out that James had had a very difficult life. He was born addicted to drugs, and he had been separated from his mom right after birth. And I found out that, unfortunately, he was not the only child in that family to have that fate. In fact, he was the 4th of 7 children to be placed in foster care. But life in care was far from being a solution to James's problem. And this is an animation of what the first 7 years of his life were like in foster care. Each of these cells are it's a different family. It's a different foster home. As unbelievable as it may seem, at age 3.5, he had already been to 13 different foster homes. And by the age 7, he was on his 17th placement, and that was not his last placement. He has been moved since then. I have moved across country with my daughter, and she was aware of what was happening. I believe I prepared her for the move, and even though I felt I saw the effects of one move, I couldn't imagine what a child that is under involuntary moves would feel like, what his life would be like, what his perceptions of the world would be like after 17 different placements in 7 years. So I wanted to believe that this was an isolated case in British Columbia, but my research did not really support that. In fact, from the 8,000 children in care in the 2011-2012 year, 56% of children were in the exact same situation that James was. He was under a continuing custody order that had permanently removed them from their family of origin. And about 40% of those children had experienced between 4 and 10 moves, and about 11% of them had more than 10, up to 20 moves while in care. And even more disconcerting is to find the negative effects associated with life in care. Children and youth are at great academic at great disadvantage. They are 7 times more likely to be in a special education program. They are also less likely to graduate from high school and less likely to meet or exceed expectations for their age and grade level. In terms of mental illness, between 1/3 and half of children in care have been diagnosed with one or multiple disorders, including PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders, and attachment disorders. They are the highest risk of suicide, and 75% of children in the youth justice system have had prior involvement in child protection system. And these effects do not stop at youth. They go on to adulthood. So foster care alumni are more likely to live in poverty and to experience homelessness and to be trapped in cycles of poverty, homelessness, and underemployment. They are also more likely to be incarcerated, especially women, and they are more likely to be involved in the child protection system, and that is also higher for women. So, and these effects are, there is a positive correlation with these effects and the number of placements, meaning that as the placements increase, so do the severity of these negative effects. So after conducting this preliminary research, I could not silence two main questions. And the first one is, how can multiple placements be so prevalent? We know the effects, we know the negative effects associated with it. It is considered an undesirable practice, no doubt, but they are still prevalent. And the other is, what accounts for the disappearance of parents? All I know in cases such as James is about the cause that led him there. We know very little. There is minimal information from government and also from research about what are the circumstances in which these families become involved. There's very little information about this. So, and this is how I venture into this research. And here's the theoretical base about this. So some of these questions were answered by Neil Gilbert, who is a sociologist in the US. And about 35 years ago, he conducted a very large comparative study amongst 9 different countries. And he found some interesting differences. He found that in Anglo-American countries, we had a very different orientation to child protection than continental and Nordic countries. He found that in North America, we held a very child protection-oriented approach, while in these other countries, they had a very family services-oriented approach. And the way the maltreatment was framed in these orientations really dictated how intervention was going to be and what kind of support families and children would, so they would be entitled to. So in North America, we have this notion of child protection in which the maltreatment is attributed to parental malevolence and dysfunction. And in understanding that the problem lies with the parent, what happens is that you have a very adversarial stance, that the state has a very adversarial stance towards the parents. And we see this in BC, in which what follows after involvement in child protection, it's actually an investigation. So family members are no longer so casted in their roles of mom and child or dad and child, but now it is plaintiff and defendant, victim and perpetrator. So right off the bat, we have this adversarial stance that we really can't get away from. And here, and in understanding that the problem is the parent, the focus of the intervention is the individual child. And the way in which the child is protected is usually through out-of-home placements. And these placements in child protection-oriented systems are typically involuntary, meaning that the parents do not agree to the removal, and that they are long-term, and usually with children aging out of care. in continental and Nordic countries at that time, he found a very different picture. He would see that there, in those countries, that the attribution of maltreatment was made to marital, familial, and socioeconomic stress. And in understanding that those things are highly circumstantial, the state had a very collaborative approach towards parents. So the idea here is to intervene individually, at a familial level and at a large societal level to reduce parental stress and increase family, so the functionality of the family. And here is a very different picture in terms of placement. Placements also happen very often, but they're very different. They are typically voluntary. Upwards of 75% of the placements are voluntary, meaning that the parents agree to the removal, but because it's short term and they don't lose any parental rights. So it is just an initiative to diffuse the stress so that you can rebuild the family unit and so that the children can return to the family of origin. All right, and in terms of outcomes, what he found is that family services typically produced so better outcomes, not only for children, but also for families. So about 30 years ago, there was a big push towards becoming more family service oriented. And 20 years later, Gilbert went back to all these countries, and he observed that there was some movement indeed. But then he started to observe that you could no longer see these big differences in all these countries, and that you have the emergence of a third orientation to child welfare, which is a child development approach. And in this approach, it is almost considered like a moderate approach to child protection. So we are no longer making any attributions to parents. We're not saying that parents are malevolent anymore, but we are not even considering parents in this equation. So we are just focusing on the fact that the parent is failing to meet the rights of the children. So that's it. And here, the stance is very paternalistic, so which means that the state will step in and it will take over the rearing of the child. And we see this in BC, and evidence of this can be seen in the fact that children who are found in need of protection are literally under the custody of the director of the MCFD. So here, the way that we intervene is early intervention. So you see this increase in early screenings and putting certain families under the radar to make sure, there's at-risk families to be under the radar and at the earliest sign, and sometimes even if the social worker believes that the maltreatment could take place, they can already intervene. So what we have here, it's and one of the mechanisms, so it's called defamilialization. At the earliest sign that may be a problematic family for the child, you have all kinds of interventions to diminish the reliance of that child on that family, but not supporting the family. You're just focusing on the child. So here we also see involuntary placements and even longer-term placements, because we are intervening a lot earlier. So interestingly, this has been taken by the ministry as they tend to show that the services happen on this continuum of a child protection, child development, which is a moderate version of child protection, and then a family services. And they also say that this continuum goes from a protective side to a notion of the family preservation. And this is precisely the focus of my critique, in that we have been trying to put these things as if they are similar. And I have two main issues with this idea of a continuum. First, it presupposes that all these orientations are similar things, that these are just different strains of the same thing. However, the child-centered approaches, the child protection and child development, they're qualitatively different from the family services. They come from two different theoretical bases. And here we also have this notion, it really implies a polarity, that either you protect a child or you preserve the family. And this only follows if you assume an individualistic perspective. If you're looking at a family service perspective, these are two sides of the same coin. These are two things that have to go hand in hand. So what I suggest is that this is perhaps a better way to describe this, that there is a huge conceptual divide here that is not acknowledged. And people have been trying to put the family services on the same side of the divide, but it's not there. And what I argue is that this child-centered oriented approaches, they presuppose an individualistic conception of selfhood. And family services, they presuppose a communal conception of selfhood. And that's why we are seeing so much difficulty in trying to implement family services into our current system, because these are two different philosophies that don't really mesh well. And so let me tell you a little bit in terms of evidence to support why these are apples and oranges. If we compare child-centered and family services, we are going to see fundamental differences in things such as the eligibility of services. In child-centered, like here in BC, for example, you have a limited access to social services. So if we take, for example, the family differential response, right, which is a program that claims to be a family service, program in child protection. This is only reserved for parents who are first really perceived to be cooperative parents, and also for parents that have in which is a very low risk case. In family services, all the services are available for all families that become involved with the system. And here it is understood that the cooperation is fostered through the provision of services. It's not a precondition for it. So you can only have cooperative parents once they have received what they need to parent well. And this is a fundamental difference. Here it is a prerequisite. It is also seen in the objectives of care. In Child Center, we have a multitude of objectives, and social workers are often asked to plan for different outcomes. And that becomes very difficult to do, because if you have an objective, you have to trace a plan according to your objective. And if you have multiple objectives, and one of them is adoption and the other is reunification, arguably, these are very different routes. And so we see things, and in terms of the prevalence, if you look at reunification, in BC, reunification with the family of origin is a declared objective in 16% of the children in care today. And in other countries, in this family services, it is an objective of care in 100% of the cases. This is a huge difference. And in Child Center, we see placements as a hallmark of protection, while in family services, this is just a means to an end. This is part of the process of getting the family together. So we can't really try to bridge these fundamental differences. And now, what do I mean about conceptions of selfhood? And here we get into the theory of it. So conceptions of selfhood are ways that human beings think of themselves as certain kinds of people and in relation to others. And far from being something that is static and universal, these are situated in a framework of meanings, ideas, classifications, and judgments that are inherently historical, social, cultural, and political. And also, And these are not just something, so these conceptions of selfhood, it's not just something that we use that color our self-perception or our self-reflection. This is something that really delineates the contour of human activity. It dictates what is a worthwhile cause, what is not a worthwhile cause, what kind of people we should be, what kind of people we should not be. And this is something that it really reverberates into institutional practices. And the kinds of people that we are or that we should not be really dictate our access to privilege and power. So this is not just something that structures our private life, but it also deeply impacts our public life. And since the 20th century in North America, we have had a very individualistic conception of selfhood. And by that, so what I mean is it's a view of individuals as ontologically bounded, independent, autonomous, with a deep interior psychological life, and an internal locus of control in which individuals are to really go out there and modify the external world to fit its own needs and desires. And Cushman explains that this kind of mentality, that this kind of conception really arose with the growing advertising agency, the mentality of consumerism that really had to advance all these capitalist needs for expansion and private property. And since the 1980s, we have come to an even more exaggerated individualistic self, which is called the enterprising self. This was a term coined by Nicholas Rose, following Foucault analysis. And that was my Portuguese talking. So the analysis of enterprising culture. So, and this enterprising self really talks about personhood, about selfhood in terms of individuals being entrepreneurs of their own lives. That, and even the language is a lot like a business, that you have to invest in yourself and you have to strategize your resources and your choices in ways that are going to maximize profit and are going to diminish risks. So you see this whole, and this is what we've been living with. So I guess we will all connect to this language because it's pretty much what we have now. And so we see here, and he talks about how psychology in particular has a huge role in propagating this individualistic conception of selfhood. In that not only does it align with the political reasoning in which it's no longer about authority, which is a government at a distance, but it has provided this political reasoning with the perfect apparatus to talk about these things. Now we can talk about problems being situated in individuals. So if we think about the story of James, for example, we can locate the problem. It's James's mom. It's there. It's an individual, and it's her. Or we can go even deeper. We can be talking about how, so I'm interiorizing all these problems. Now I can talk about how she's neurochemically so addicted to drugs, and I can pinpoint the exact part of her brain in which all of this is happening. And I can go even deeper, and I can talk about genetics. So we can keep on going inside this onion for a long time. And psychology has allowed for that because we have a mainly individualistic methodology. And so this conception of selfhood really has formulated the pursuit of a meaningful life in terms of individual responsibility, choice, and freedom. And it is here that and it is exactly here that the experience of families in care really does not match with all this discourse. And I will take a sip of water, and I will just leave here the testimonial of one of these moms involved in the child protection system. And I want you to keep in mind these three things. I want you to try to locate this notion of choice, of her individual responsibility, and the notion of freedom. So I will leave it here for a second. I'll be right back. Are we okay with that? Okay, now I will read along with you, okay? It's quite a lengthy, and this is just like part of this excerpt, but I believe that this is very telling of the story that I'm trying to tell here. So then she goes on to say, so my daughter needed dental work. My youngest was born at 20 weeks, barely 3 pounds. The ministry started by demanding me to take my youngest to the doctor because he was so small. They then got someone to help me get my IDs and to help cart my kids around. I was unable to get income support without my IDs. They then started to harass me, telling me to put my kids in voluntary care because of all the catch-up they needed and because I did not drive. After being harassed and promised it was just until I got onto my feet, I agreed reluctantly. I wanted my sons to get all the help they needed as fast as possible, even though it broke my heart and I have never been away from my children for an extended amount of time. I had to sign the voluntary care agreement or they would take me to court. So without my children, I found out I cannot get income support, nor was I getting any other kind of benefit. The ministry then put my kids under supervised visits and cut my visits down to 2 hours twice a week. I was devastated, but stayed strong for my children. They did not understand, asking me if they could stay with me, telling me how much they miss me. This went on for a year. I did everything I was supposed to do: counseling, parenting courses, my visits, and my kids' appointments. I was unable to find a job having such a big gap in work history and having to always be on the go to do what the ministry asked. I then got a new social worker who did not want to talk or even to be human to me. I fell more and more behind financially. I couldn't get everything I needed: clothes, furniture, extra savings to get my kids back in my care. Around my birthday, I got a call telling me that they had an adoptive parent for all 3 of my kids in Upper BC. I was devastated. There was nothing more I could do. I was told that the next visit would be my last and to give myself time to grieve. And she finishes with what I believe cuts through the heart of the matter. I do not understand how this was better than to just help me get on my feet. If I had money, a car, and a family support, this would not have happened. They paid the foster care parents around $803 for my research for each kid, my oldest being over $1,100 for being special needs. If even half of this money had been given to me, the parent, to help me get on my feet, this would not have happened. And it's heart-wrenching to hear these kinds of stories. And you wonder how can we justify separation of a loving family How can we make sense of this? And I think that the only way that we can understand is if you assume an individualistic perspective. And if I understand that, if I understand that you have a family, I have to move over there. If I have a family who is, I'll go back. So if you have a family who's not really well formed there, who is struggling to find its balance, but you have a very well-rounded child, and this is the child that is identified as in need of protection. So under an individualistic lens, where I understand that individuals are independent, that the social cultural context is merely influential, it's not constitutive of someone's life, it makes sense that I just take that child and I place it in a well-rounded family, and the problem is addressed. So from an individualistic perspective, this individual intervention is not only appropriate, but it's also fully comprehensive. But my argument is that in assuming this individualistic perspective in child protection, we are doing nothing but individualizing social problems. We are deflecting the attention from the context, that we are hindering reunification, and that we are supporting a very reactive stance to child welfare. And I'm going to go back to James's case to make this point here. It is true that James's mom would really require a great deal of individual responsibility to care for her 7 children, that she would have to make better choices. The point is focusing on her addiction really, it does nothing to address how she could be back with her family. And that goes for her and for all other families that are involved in the system. If we only focus on her behavior, we are really not paying attention to the fact that she herself was a foster care alumni, that she had multiple placements, that she went through a very serious trauma in childhood with sexual abuse, that her mother herself was in a residential school, that she lived in a reserve with very little access to services, such as education and healthcare, that she was in an endless cycle of going to the city and not being able to find work and going back to the reserve in improper housing. And when I focus on her behavior, I'm missing all this big picture. And arguably, had she received an intervention at the time that she had the 2nd child in care, had the intervention been effective at the 2nd child around, James would not be in foster care. But yet, we choose to go individually, taking one child by one and doing nothing to address the causes that have, to a large extent, led these families to be involved in child protection in the first place. So we are really not enabling any reunification, and this is a very reactive stance. So, and this is not just, and these are not just anecdotal cases. This is largely supported by research. If we look at the 2 main categories, 2 main primary categories of maltreatment, which is neglect and exposure to domestic violence, which is about almost 70% of the cases, they are highly correlated with social disadvantage. And we see this here in British Columbia, where the 2 most overrepresented groups are also the 2 most socially disadvantaged groups. It is estimated that 86% of the investigations regard mothers, and in the majority of this, of these cases, the mothers are bearing the full brunt of the parenting, and half of these moms are also victims of domestic violence. The number one risk factor for these moms is lack of social support. It's not having someone with whom you can leave your children so that you can look for employment. It's not having someone to help you with the task of parenting. It's not having, and a lot of the times, lacking the basic needs, having to choose between paying for electricity or food or shelter. And this makes it even more concerning here in BC, in which we have the highest rate of juvenilization and feminization of poverty in Canada, which is unimaginable. And about 50% of single moms in Canada, in BC, live on less than $20,000 a year. In terms of the Aboriginal population, so despite being just 8% of the child population in the province, 52% of the children in care today are Aboriginal. Compared to non-Aboriginal children, Aboriginal children are 7.5 times more likely to be in care and 13.5 more times to remain in care after they've had a file open in child protection. So it is widely known that, and the main category of ingress into the system is neglect, but it's a neglect driven by poverty. So this has been a main topic of concern, and as you know, so the representative for children and youth, Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon, she has written more than 16 different reports since 2006 talking about Indigenous children and making serious recommendations about how to address it. And yet, in her analysis, we have not really gone far, and that there's still a lot of room to cover. And and Aboriginal children in care are at a triple jeopardy. Not only do they lose access to their parents, but to their kinship network and also their cultural context, including their language and their connection to the land. And here's a quote from some Aboriginal scholars that I believe it's very much to the point of selfhood. So I'll give you a second to take a quick look at it. Very good. All right. So the answer from the ministry was, so not only here in BC, but also all over Canada, was to create the DAAs, which are Delegated Aboriginal Agencies. And here the attempt, so according to the MCFD, this is an opportunity to return historic responsibilities for child protection and family support to Aboriginal families. The idea here is that by giving all these Aboriginal communities the opportunity for them to take care of the services which were previously done by the mainstream office and non-Aboriginal social workers, for example. So the idea is that by giving them the opportunity to provide the services, that we would have a better quality, because you would understand what these Aboriginal ways of being. And so in 1986 is when we have the first DAA, and now in 2015 we have about 23 DAAs. and they serve about 116 of the 200 First Nations group in the province, and they provide partial or full level service to 47% of Aboriginal children in care. The problem with it is that Aboriginal agencies are prevented from doing what they believe it's the Aboriginal way of doing things, because the legislation still remains based on Western concepts. So in a sense, all the work that is done by Aboriginal agencies, when it comes time of the adjudication, you are still measured up against concepts that are Western. And we are still focusing on things such as individuality, independence, which are values that are highly Western. These do not align. So you are encouraged to provide the services under an Indigenous philosophy, but when it comes time that you have to have this adjudicated, all of this is perceived as a waste of time. And interestingly, even the representative for children and youth has had a very grim assessment of how much work has been done in terms of the services. And I think it's missing a little bit of this point as well, because it's very focused on the procedures and talking about in terms of jurisdiction, but it's really missing this cultural point and how circumscribed these DAAs are. So in a sense, it sounds like a Sisyphean task in which you do all the work and you get up there, oh no, you gotta go back. And here we are seeing the exact same kind of critique that I had before, that you were trying to bridge two things that are inherently different. So how do we move forward? And this is not only for Aboriginal children, this is for all the children that are in care. We have to have an ontological redefinition. We have to have a historical and social-cultural perspective, and we have to abide to a more communal conception of selfhood. If we understand that individuals are born into cultures that precede them, and that our selfhood is fostered in interactivity and this process of appropriation of social cultural traditions and practices that are inherently political, cultural, and societal, we are going to have a very different picture in how we are going to provide services. Arguably, we would be able to broaden the existing interventional practices and policies to incorporate not only the child, but also the families and the communities. You would not see children as separate from their families. You would see them as integrated. So if you want to get to the child, you have to work on the whole unit. But this is inserted in this context, so we have to work on the context. And so it is a profoundly different approach to welfare. It would also relieve the individual parents and the individual children from the burden of sole responsibility and change. What happens today is that, and it's interesting, it's a paradox in the sense that we think that we are protecting the child, and yet we are putting all the burden of change in this individual child to adapt to the new family, to adapt to the new situation, which means utter separation from who you are. And this is closely aligned with communal Aboriginal ways of being and acting in the world, and with communal conceptions and with these Aboriginal communal notions of welfare. And also, this would provide a blueprint for the integration of services. It seems in Heather Age's story, I think that what is so impactful in that story is that you see a woman who's trying to flee from abuse, and when the abuse comes to light and she comes to the point that she's going to have help, in her perception, she's going to have help. What happens is that that she loses her children. And this is often what happens with domestic violence, because we have two silo approaches. Each one is concerned with protecting the individual person. In the case of domestic violence, is protecting the women or the men, and in the case of children, is protecting the children. But what happens is that there is no correlation, there is no real talk, and there's no real coordination of services. So what typically happens is that moms lose the ability of being with their kids. So typically moms, right? So 86% of the cases, but dads as well. So I will leave you with a thought from Nicholas Rose, and this is precisely what I'm trying to do with this research. If we cannot disinvent ourselves, we might at least enhance the contestability of the forms of being that have been invented for us and begin to reinvent ourselves differently. I hope that this research is it's pointing to the direction that we should be going, because I believe that we deserve differently, and these children and families in care, they deserve differently. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Elisa, for a very informative talk. We'll now have a short question and answer. We'll have a short question and answer period. And when you have a question, we have a microphone there that we can use. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating presentation. I was just wondering if you looked at all at the work of Frantz Fanon in terms of colonial context with black skin, white masks, and I guess I'm also referencing the work of Glenn Coulthard in Red Skin, White Masks that kind of looks at colonialism as a continuing practice, that's something even in the era of reconciliation and these types of broader processes, apologies on reforms within systems, that in some sense, because of the orientation that you speak of, this type of relation, and I'm just, with theorists like Fanon, who was talking about it in a specific context, I'm wondering if you would view his work as relevant to your research.
It sounds like it would be really relevant. I am not familiar with the work. And this is definitely an area that I really want to spend a lot more time. You know, like I said in the beginning, I didn't really set out to talk about Aboriginal issues. This has been kind of an ongoing theme, and also in the climate of self-confessions here, I think that as a non-Aboriginal researcher, I always kind of tiptoed around it because I didn't really know how to approach it. You know, I was very concerned about saying the wrong thing or maybe having a different lens. But it is something that I'm willing to pursue, so I would be very curious to get all these references and look at this work. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. I wanted to thank you as well. It was very articulate, and you said a lot of things that really resonate for me, but you say them much better, so it was great.
Thank you.
I'm a social worker and a counselor, and I have a family systems approach, so I'm totally on board with working with families in that way. But what I wanted to ask you is, as somebody who's lived in Canada now for quite a while, and I've seen the social safety net here be totally eroded, right, over the last 30 years. And it's very frustrating as a social worker or as a counselor because I feel it's political and it's about money, and I don't understand why it's changed so much, right? Why are we in this environment where we're branding ourselves, right, to get by? So I just wondered if you spoke to anybody in your research in government, because we all know what should change as social workers and counselors, a lot of us, right?
Yes. You know, I have had the opportunity to talk to Marielle Tripelafon, and it was a great talk. And unfortunately, it boils down to political action. And And the way that I'm trying to get about to this precise point that you're talking is that in my current research, what I'm doing is having a comparison. So it's a comparative study, much like what Neil Gilbert has done with all these countries. But what I'm focusing in BC and hopefully Sweden. And my idea here is to, because I think the governments respond much better to proven models than to say, hey, here's a theoretical idea that I think you should buy into, right? And this is essentially, I have a very theoretical base, but I figured that that would be the best way to get this point across, that we have to invest in these theoretical ideas. And I believe that through this comparison of models and say, hey, this is what they're doing, this is what we are doing, these are the kind of outcomes that they're getting, and these are the outcomes that we are getting, I think it makes a compelling political case, especially because now in Canada, what's happening is that we are literally recycling these children through the system, and then it goes from child protection to youth justice system, and it keeps going. So in a sense, in a political and in an economic sense, I think that there will be some meat on the bones for the politicians to buy into, and you will get this point across.
So you mean comparing to the Scandinavian countries? Okay.
Yeah.
So government has known this for a long time. Mm-hmm. So it's not just government. I think it's the Canadian people. We're accepting a different set of values than people used to have 30 years ago even. And it's just getting worse, right? So I find it, I know the theory, and I think a lot of them know the theory, but they also know the practical reality of how good things are in Scandinavian countries, and even though they're having challenges now too with immigration, right? But it's about values, and the Canadian values seems to have changed.
Well, I think that you kind of hit the nail in the head when you said about 30 years ago. Yeah. And if we trace it back, it's really this enterprising notion of selfhood that we have really bought into it. And I think that what we are trying, what has kind of come out of this research is to really connect the dots. My idea was to say, this is the conception of selfhood that we have. This is what's happening to these children. I'm holding this mirror, and you tell me, what do you think? Are you happy with this? And I think that it is a very inconvenient thing for a lot of people to hear what I have to say, for example. But I think it starts the conversation, right? And I think that if we have this ontological change in education, in institutional practices, I think it's a beginning. It's a beginning to change this mentality, that see that we are connected, that we can't keep on thinking individually about this. I hope it answers your question.
Well, I just find it I just think it's going to be so hard to get those people to change, because we've had 30 years of it going this other way, and it seems to be accelerating that way.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you're going to get it turned around, right? Especially with the media the way it is. I mean, how does that
tough,
happen? Right?
But I'm an incorrectable optimist, so hopefully it will serve to something. All right. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, everybody. It was a pleasure. And if you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. You have my email there. It will be a pleasure to touch base and see how you might be doing things that really connect to this work. Thank you so much. Thanks.